This week on The Wheelhouse. The historic indictment of President Donald Trump. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics on Connecticut Public right here.
Former President Donald J. Trump charged with 34 felonies here in New York City. He pleaded not guilty and hightailed it back to his adopted home state of Florida.
There is former President Trump exiting the courtroom. Let's see. Let's just watch and take in the scene.
There it is, about 5 seconds, but 5 seconds of history in this country. The first time we have ever seen a president, former or current, criminally charged. We know he's already been booked. He is a criminal defendant entering a courtroom.
Some of that drama on The Wheelhouse this week. Former President Donald Trump dominated cable news last week when he appeared in a Manhattan court, pleaded not guilty to 34 felony criminal charges. On March 30th, a Manhattan grand jury voted to indict Trump in connection to hush money payments to the adult film star Stormy Daniels during his 2016 campaign. Despite the 34 criminal charges, Trump is still very much in the running for president. So how will this play out in 2024? For that and more, we got a great panel for you. We got a couple of guests on Zoom and one in person. First on Zoom, we have Maya King, politics reporter for the New York Times. Good morning, Maya.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. And also on Zoom, we have Asha Rangappa, who is a lawyer and former FBI special agent and assistant dean and senior lecturer at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. Good morning, Asha.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
And in studio, sitting across from me right now, somebody that a lot of people in Connecticut know, Liz Koranowitz, the Republican strategist and political analyst. Good morning.
Good morning.
If you're wanting to join in on this conversation and have some fun with us this morning, or if you want to get serious for a minute, give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Maya, can you take the first question here? Before we look ahead to 2024, I want to catch listeners up on what's happened in the past week. What are the latest updates on all things Trump indictment?
Well, I think the biggest news out of the last 24 hours now is the news that Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan district attorney, is actually suing Jim Jordan of Ohio. We know that Representative Jordan was seeking to start to look closer in Congress at what exactly was happening with this indictment. Mr. Bragg is suing Mr. Jordan to say this is really not yet in the public interest and called it an extreme overstep. So this has sort of upped the ante, I think, on what's happening politically around the indictment and the ways that it's become so heavily politicized. We know that Republicans have aimed to paint this indictment largely as politically motivated and almost frivolous, but Democrats and Mr. Bragg's office maintain that this is a very serious, that these are very serious charges and that this is still a legal proceeding that is in progress. And so my colleagues at the New York Times had this story yesterday, and it's really, I think, underlined the stakes and just how closely folks are paying attention to this.
Big time back and forth between Alvin Bragg right now and Jim Jordan. Jim Jordan essentially in the House Republicans saying that they're going to go to New York City to witness a city filled with crime, something like that in their words. And then Alvin Bragg going back and forth telling Jordan to just drive to cities in his state to look at places where Alvin Bragg says there's more crime than there are in New York City. So a back and forth there. Asha, I want to bring you in on the conversation. Just now looking kind of and zooming out on this whole situation, we're talking about a historic indictment. You think we've seen anything like this happen before in the United States?
Well, we've never had any former president charged, but we've had presidents who've come close, right? And I think it's an important point to make that Nixon potentially faced criminal liability after he left office. Bill Clinton potentially faced criminal liability after he left office. And in both of those cases, those individuals Nixon stepped down. He made a speech. He accepted responsibility. I mean, that could have been a public gesture. Same with Bill Clinton, who also publicly apologized. And as a result, in Nixon's case, Ford decided to pardon him. And part of that was to spare the nation of going through this. But I think it made it easier for him to go down that route, knowing that Nixon had resigned. Similarly, Bill Clinton reached an agreement with the independent counsel to accept a fine and to have his bar license suspended in Arkansas, which again was some form of punishment that allowed the prosecutor to say, okay, I don't need to take this extra step. I think what we've seen with Trump is an absolute unwillingness to accept any responsibility in any of these cases. And there's multiple, which I think pushes the envelope, because then we want to see some form of accountability. And this is why I think we're now in this unprecedented space.
Asha, let's drill down a little further on this. We're talking about 34 charges. Are they actually felonies?
They are charged as felonies, yes. So the charge is for falsification of business records, which in New York law is ordinarily a misdemeanor unless the falsification is done with the intent to commit or conceal another crime. So each of the 34 counts alleges that Trump falsified business records with the intent to conceal or commit another crime. So they're all felony counts. The big question is, and this was the big surprise, I think, for legal commentators who are waiting for this to come out, that the indictment does not state what the other crime is that Trump intended to commit. And we can talk more about this. My understanding is that in New York, you don't actually have to specify what the other crime is. And in fact, you don't even need to specify it to a jury. And a jury does not even have to agree on what the other crime is. So this is not necessarily a departure from standard practice. However, it does raise a lot of questions about the lack of specificity in terms of what precisely the conduct is that he's being charged for.
Lawyer Asha Rangappa helping us out with the indictment here this morning. Asha, just one more time on the hush money end of it. Is paying hush money a crime?
Paying hush money is not a crime, and I think it's important to understand that that's not what is being criminalized here. What the theory is that paying the hush money and getting Stormy Daniels' silence in return was a benefit to Trump's campaign in 2016. The value of that benefit, that in-kind contribution, was $130,000. And therefore, that was a campaign contribution that needed to be disclosed. And the failure to disclose is what is the campaign finance violation that is a crime. Again, we don't know whether that is the specific one that is underlying these felony charges, but that is one avenue.
So, Asha, this is Liz. I have a question for you. Obviously, we've seen a similar case play out like this before with presidential candidates, and that was obviously John Edwards, right? How, in your mind, does this, perform in legal courses in terms of, bumping up against that? And if this was the underlying charge that would make this a felony, why wouldn't Bragg just go ahead and say that, right? I mean, why not lay it out? Because it, as you said earlier, the lack of specificity really just lends itself to undermining any effort that Bragg and other prosecutors have on this case in particular to make a case against Donald Trump.
So the difference between Trump's case and John Edwards with regard to the campaign finance violation, I think, goes to intent. John Edwards he had many donors providing support to take care of his mistress who was pregnant during the campaign. And I think that There was arguably mixed motives of trying to keep that secret. His wife was undergoing cancer treatment. His children didn't know. He had a colorable case that this was to protect his family from embarrassment or hurt, et cetera. And that the precise intent wasn't to not disclose this as part of a campaign expenditure. I think the difference with Trump is that his payment to Stormy Daniels is happening right on the eve of the election, right after the Access Hollywood tape breaks, and where this can truly affect his candidacy. And importantly, a detail that is contained in the statement of facts that Bragg filed is that Trump instructed Michael Cohen, his lawyer at the time, to try to delay making the payment to Stormy Daniels as long as he could, and ideally until after the election. And at that point, they could renege on the agreement because he didn't care at that point if she came out with the story. To me, that's sort of the smoking gun, that this was only about about helping his candidacy. So I think that that's the difference. However, having said that, it's important to understand Bragg is not charging a campaign finance violation. He does not have to prove all of the elements of that crime. As I mentioned before, he doesn't even need to specify this. And the problem with potentially even invoking the federal campaign law as the crime that he was intending to commit, it's just the intent to commit it, is that because Trump was running for president, this implicates federal campaign finance laws, Federal Election Campaign Act. And there's this idea in law called federal preemption, which is that that law may preempt state enforcement. I think that may not apply in this case because it's really being used as an enhancement, not as something that, he's invoking directly. So it's kind of legally complicated. I should note that he's also alluding to a state election crime, which is a conspiracy to promote a candidate using unlawful means. And that is a state crime, which arguably Bragg could say was also a part of the intent to falsify these records.
Just want to button up one more thing on John Edwards of North Carolina and that charge in 2011 of federal campaign finance violations. The case ended without a conviction.
Correct.
What questions do you have about Trump's indictment? Folks, I think I'm getting a little confident here, but I'm fairly confident that our panel may be able to answer some of those questions. Let us know by calling 888-720-9677, 888-720-WNPR. Asha, one more time to you here. I want to talk about the implications, both kind of legal and political, of Trump's indictment. Legally, what does this mean for him?
Well, he's got to defend himself in court now. I mean, one thing that he's done is by taking this step, he's now under the jurisdiction of this court, right? So he has certain rules and things that he's going to have to do. It's not like in the investigative phase where he can kind of just run roughshod and do whatever he wants. And we've seen one example of this is potentially bumping up against a gag order if a judge chooses to issue one, if Trump continues to make, veiled threats against the judge and the prosecutor, et cetera. Like, there are consequences for his behavior. More broadly, if we see, and I do see more charges coming down the pipeline from Georgia, from the special counsel, Jack Smith, this is going to take up a lot of his time and energy. It is not a pleasant experience to be charged with a crime. It's certainly not a pleasant experience to be charged with a crime in 4 different cases in 3 different jurisdictions. And so this will take a toll on him. It's going to require a lot of his time and energy and attention. And I think that it could impact his campaign. And I mean, I'm not a political analyst, but I do think that at some point I imagine that there is some portion of a voting base that will say, we kind of prefer candidates who are under indictment.
Luckily, in this panel, we got a political analyst here. I just want to say, though, Trump's team has until, this is according to CNN, Trump's team has until August 8th to file any motions, and the prosecution will respond by September 19th. The judge overseeing the case said he'll rule on the motions at the next in-person hearing scheduled for December 4th. Liz, I want to get into the politics of all this now. What do you think sort of the immediate political impact of this indictment?
Well, so far, the immediate political impact has been at minimum $10 million raised by the Trump campaign in the immediate aftermath of the indictment, and billions of dollars in earned media, right? Free press for Donald Trump. If you recall, back in the 2016 election, the president's first campaign, he got $4.6 billion in earned media in the primary process, which, I mean, completely wiped out any financial advantage, any advantage overall that his opponents in that primary had. And so when you look at all of the coverage, this conversation and every conversation that's happened in the press relating to the indictment, this is the advantage for Donald Trump, because he remains the focus. And whether you love him or hate him, he engenders the most emotional responses from voters that I think we've seen in generations, right? Certainly in modern American political history. And so for him, this is certainly having an impact. The money to his campaign is clearly an advantage over his opponents. It certainly brings some issues with it. I think Asha made the point, right? There are a lot of people, Republican primary voters, caucus goers, right? Iowa's the first stop. If you're an evangelical voter in the Iowa caucus, is this something that is, maybe you were a Trump supporter and this is something that's going to turn you off? But the issue is, there's really no negative ad you can run against Donald Trump that's effective in a presidential primary, right? Everyone knows who he is, and everyone has an opinion of him. And so it really does become very difficult. This is all baked into the cake and how people feel about him. And all it really does is put the people who have such strong feelings in support of him, it just makes them even more fervent supporters. It's a man and a former president who seem to be willing to take a mugshot if necessary for this particular case. And Maya, I'm going to give you the last question here before we get out. What's been the response from Trump's fellow Republicans? Are they showing their support for him?
Well, they've had to walk kind of a really thin line here, because they do want to show some level of support for the former president that does not completely alienate them from his base that they really want to cut into, especially for the 2024 presidential contenders. But largely what we're hearing, what all Republicans have been united in their messaging on this, has been in the substance of this case. Everyone that I've talked to, Republicans, from candidates to folks who talk with them to even voters, is saying that they feel that the substance of the case, that hush money payments to a porn star paid for by a millionaire businessman, just does not constitute this level of attention, even if he was a former president. And so a lot of folks have been saying that they feel is more politically motivated than it is, anything else to really pay attention to. I think also one person that we've all been paying close attention to, of course, is Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, because this is the former president's biggest competition, I think, in the 2024 primary. And he himself has had to walk a really thin line here. So he said, I'm not really sure about the substance of hush money payments, but he also has said himself that he feels that this is very politically motivated and sort of a sham in the public sphere at this point.
More on what DeSantis is saying, or rather not saying, after this. Hey, we're having a scintillating conversation on the Trump indictment, and we've only just begun. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. You're listening to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. You're listening to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're talking about the recent indictment of Donald Trump and what it could mean for the 2024 presidential elections. Talk about our guests and bring them back in a second. Just first, I want to let you all know that you could call 888-720-9677 if you want to get in on this conversation. And we have somebody joining us right now, Mary Jane from North Stonington. Go ahead. What's your question?
Oh, hello. I wondered if what the panel thought about Trump's chances of getting the place of the trial moved, like, say, to upstate New York rather than the liberal New York City. I didn't know if he had a chance or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anybody want to take that?
I can take it. So he'll file a motion for...
This is Asha. Thank you so much. I appreciate
yes, sorry. He'll file a motion for a change of venue. I believe they did this in the prosecution for the Trump organization, and it's unlikely to be granted. I mean, they would have to show that there is really no way that they would be able to select an unbiased and impartial jury. And, I don't think that a judge would be amenable to that. By the way, I'll just add that Trump recently in an interview with Tucker Carlson mentioned that when he was being booked in the Manhattan courthouse, there were so many people crying and telling him how badly they felt for him. So that kind of undermines his any assertion that he might make that, he doesn't have people who could be sympathetic to him in Manhattan. But he will file a motion for a change of venue. It's not going to be, I'll say it's very unlikely that it will be granted, and it hasn't been granted before for the prosecution for his own organization.
This is Liz, and Asha, to that point, I mean, as President of the United States, you're not going to go somewhere where people don't know who he is and don't have a formed opinion. And so I think the big issue is, regardless of where the trial is, if it's moved or not, finding impartial jurors, and that process itself of screening jurors and really understanding whether or not people are willing to give Donald Trump a fair shake. And that is the foundation of our justice system.
That's right.
So I think one thing in particular that I have thought about in watching just the visuals and thinking about this overall is how grateful I am to live in the state of Connecticut, where we don't have politically elected prosecutors and judges. I think that it undermines all of the just inherently undermines it when you have partisan politics play a role in the judicial system. And I know Connecticut is unique in that way, right? There are many, many states where prosecutors and judges are elected. But I think it lends itself to an extremely political conversation about the prosecution when you look at it through the lens that these are elected officials, and their re-election hinges in many ways on their ability to follow through.
The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano, your host, and with me, you just heard Liz Koranowitz, who's actually in studio, who's right across from me, Republican strategist and political analyst. And then we have Asha Rangappa, who is a lawyer and former FBI special agent and assistant dean and senior lecturer at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. And Maya King, politics reporter for the New York Times. Maya, next question goes to you. We talked a little bit about Ron DeSantis at the end of that last segment. Been a lot of talk about the Florida governor and whether or not he's running in 2024. How does the Trump indictment affect DeSantis's political calculus?
Well, it's interesting. I kind of look at this Trump indictment through from Trump's standpoint more than I do from DeSantis' standpoint. And what I mean by that is this, as we've already said, has made the former president so much of a sympathetic figure to the Republican base. Even voters who have rolled their eyes at his drama over the last several weeks, really years, kind of see this indictment and the substance of this indictment as a little bit frivolous, and it has endeared them to him in many ways. And so now this creates a bigger problem for a candidate like Governor DeSantis, because he has couched so much of his pre-presidential run message in the fact that he will champion Trump-like policies, but will come without the Trump drama. Now you have Trump embroiled in even more drama, And all that it's done is almost had this blowback on DeSantis's candidacy, and that it has drawn more voters to Trump's corner. It's given him more money, and it's also given former President Trump a lot more time and airtime to go after Governor Ron DeSantis on the airwaves and in interviews and just even in fundraising emails. We already see him starting to attack the Florida governor here. But it's extremely early in the primary season. And so Governor DeSantis still does have time to craft a message and to try to find a way around this. But I think, again, this is sort of a repeat of 2016 in many ways, where you have this candidate who has just sucked up so much of the oxygen that it's made it harder for the person directly behind him to really break through.
888-720-9677, the number to call if you want to join us on the Wheelhouse. And right now we got a guest, Kyle from West Hartford. What's your question? We lost Kyle from West Hartford. That's okay. And this gives me a good opportunity now to go to Liz Koranowitz on this. The odds that former President Donald Trump, can win in 2024.
I think that the bigger issue, absent the indictment, the issue for any one of the candidates that is in the race or is contemplating getting into the race is the fact that you sort of have, again, Donald Trump has the most sort of emotionally resonant supporters we've seen, right? I mean, there are people who will go into great lengths in support of Donald Trump. The issue is how many Republican primary voters are not Donald Trump voters. And what happens is it's math, right? You have 5 candidates. If you go into the Iowa caucuses, and I've talked to folks who are on the ground there, and let's say, for sake of argument, 50% of Iowa caucus goers are open to another candidate that's not Donald Trump. The problem is they're splitting their vote between Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, potentially Tim Scott, potentially Glenn Youngkin, and who else, right? So, when you've got all of Trump's supporters are locked and loaded, ready to vote for him no matter what, clearly, and then you've got the remaining, segment of the primary population, you're really splitting up a vote that could be against Trump, but going in many directions.
Is this sort of a bigger problem for the Republican Party, though? Because, we talked about Trump's base and how they come out for him every time. But I think I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were talking about specifically you had that recent Supreme Court race in Wisconsin. So necessarily Trump voters may be coming out for Trump, but are they coming out for other candidates in the same kind of way? Or is this kind of alienating, I guess, other people that might be more moderate Republicans?
The answer is no, right? I mean, there is a big difference between a Republican base voter and a Trump voter, right? Donald Trump has a lot of support among voters who are not Republican, and they are Trump-only voters in many cases. And we saw that in what happened in the Georgia runoff in January after the 2020 election. So I think, again, that's what makes this so unique, is that you have Donald Trump coming to the table with a significant base of Republican support in a primary, and then everyone else trying to figure out who their candidate is among, potentially a half dozen other candidates.
Asha, right now it kind of seems like Trump has 2 options here. It could be prison or president. I kind of came up with that before the show, and I thought that was cute. Prison or president. Is that a fair assessment? I don't know. Maybe Meg Dalton, our producer, came up with it. One of us did. Prison or president. What do you think about that?
Do you mean legally?
Yeah.
Oh, he can be president in prison.
Oh, wow. Do tell.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing in the Constitution that prevents him from running for office, charged with a crime or even convicted of a crime, or there's nothing that constitutionally would prevent him from being elected president, even if he were convicted and sitting in jail. So that's where we are.
Are you a Republican voter in Connecticut? Let us know your thoughts on the Trump's indictment by calling us at 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Interesting fact to talk about a potential presidency in prison. What are your thoughts about that assessment I gave earlier, Liz, about the prison or presidency kind of assessment there?
I mean, look, I don't think we get there, right? I mean, I think some of this is going to depend largely on, who the Democrats put up for their candidate, right? I mean, this is not in a vacuum. If it's a rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, frankly, there are not many voters that I've talked to who think that's a win for the American people. I think people are looking for a different perspective and different candidates. And so to me, a lot of this hinges on who did the Democrats nominate? Who are they going to put forward? Joe Biden's poll numbers are not good. There are not people who believe the country is going in the right direction under his leadership. Obviously, we saw a very small majority of Republicans elected into the U.S. House. So I think voters are going to be looking for other choices. And the question is, do Republicans nominate Donald Trump, or do we embrace someone like a Tim Scott, who is positive, who is forward-looking, Glenn Youngkin, and the list goes on of candidates that will offer an alternative to that perspective? And what do Democrats do? This is not an entirely Republican Party issue. The Democrats are going to play a huge role here. Are they going to renominate Joe Biden? And if they do, I think this becomes a referendum on Joe Biden's presidency.
We're having a little bit of an issue with Liz's mic. We'll work on that in the break. But before we go to a break, I just want to go to Maya, just to get a sense of, we were just talking about Republican voters and what they were thinking about. What about independent or swing voters, Maya? What do you think?
Well, I think we'll have a clearer picture of what independent voters think once we have two nominees, I believe, or two party nominees for president. But I know that Democrats are really courting those voters, and their calculus is if former President Donald Trump is the nominee, then independents who have shown a pattern of being very turned off by the former president's antics, both in office and out, would probably float closer to supporting Democrats. We don't know what that looks like at this stage and what it could look like, even if we do have former President Donald Trump as the nominee and Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee. It's really too early, I believe, to tell exactly where independents might float. But I think for now, in this moment, they kind of remain true to form in being pretty roughed up, or at least turned off by everything swirling around the indictment news.
I saw this in Maya's reporting in the New York Times. Quinnipiac University poll that came out right before the indictment indicates that 1 in 4 Republicans and 1 in 3 independents said criminal charges should disqualify Trump as a presidential candidate. I want to ask Maya what she thinks as she's talked to some of these sort of swing voters and what they're telling her. But before we do that, we're going to go to a break from Connecticut Public. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You can join in the conversation if you'd like, 888-720-9677. But first, we'd like to have you hear from a couple of people that work at Connecticut Public about the great things that we do here. Back to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public, and one of our guests is Maya King, who is a reporter for the New York Times. Maya, you talked to some of the swing voters that we're talking to about this 2024 election and the Trump indictment. What are they telling you, Maya? What are some of the swing voters telling you when you have these interviews with them?
Well, I am based in Atlanta and spend a lot of time in the outer Atlanta suburbs and exurbs. And that's where you find a lot of these Republican swing voters who may have voted for Governor Brian Kemp for governor, and then Senator Raphael Warnock, the Democrat, and for the Senate, just to give an example. And a lot of these folks, I mean, when I talk to them and ask them about what's happening as it relates to the indictment, I mean, if they consider themselves sort of Republican or conservative swing voters, they have tired of what's happening with the former president, and they're waiting for an alternative, whether that's Ron DeSantis, Tim Scott, who's announced his Presidential Exploratory Committee today, or anybody else that they might have in mind, someone like Glenn Youngkin even. I think there's a real desire among particularly, again, conservative swing voters or conservative-leaning swing voters who might want to see a Republican president in the White House in 2024. The pattern that I've observed is that there's a lot of fatigue and frustration with former President Trump, even as they might appreciate his policies. And now there's a real yearning for just someone else to carry the banner, who might be able to continue this policy making, but bring a level of decorum, at least, not having to deal with criminal legal proceedings while they're also running for president.
Maya King, politics reporter at the New York Times, one of three great panelists joining me here today, sitting right across from me in studio. Liz Koranowitz, Republican strategist and political analyst. Asha Rangappa, a lawyer and former FBI special agent, also joining us right now via Zoom. She's also assistant dean and senior lecturer at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. And I just wanted to kind of continue this conversation. Liz, can you give me a local sense of kind of how people in Connecticut Republicans, they're kind of feeling about 2024?
Look, I think similar to what Maya's hearing is that, I think that there are a lot of voters on the Republican primary side who are anxious for a change, who are looking for an alternative. Likewise, like I said, there are voters who are comfortable with what's happening with the president.
Liz, your mic's popping in and out. For some reason, we can't get it. We're going to continue to try to work on Liz's microphone. It's a conspiracy against Liz. We're trying to take down Liz and the Republican Party. I apologize for that, Liz. I hear you a little bit now. Let's see if we can try to get you one more time. Go ahead.
Sure. Sorry about that. I think it's a very similar situation. Obviously, you go all over the place. I think there are a lot of Republicans who are looking forward to an alternative. And I think that what's important in this cycle compared to the 2020 cycle is you have so many Republicans stepping up to say, I believe I can be the standard bearer. I believe I can take the country in a different direction. And what makes Tim Scott unique, I think, in this situation is out of all the candidates, our politics have gotten so visceral, so negative, and so backward looking. And the difference between Tim Scott and every other candidate, I think, is that Tim Scott is incredibly positive. He has a very aspirational message, which is counter to the politics that we've had going back for a very long time, and probably to 2012, right? So I think that it'll be very interesting to see how the candidates that are in the running are able to raise money and are able to continue to fuel a campaign in the coming months when they're going up against Donald Trump, who clearly has a financial advantage and frankly, the earned media advantage offers him billions of dollars in free press that no other candidate is going to receive.
Nobody, though, talking at all about Trump or like I said, you're saying that there's an opportunity to be positive, but nobody at least harping on the negative of what's happening with Donald Trump. We should note that so far, just one of Trump's competitors in 2024, former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, denounced Trump. He said Trump should step aside. Maybe Chris Christie might run or something like that. Chris Christie's been talking a little bit about him. But Asha, kind of begging the question here, why does Donald Trump, do you think, have such a big grip on the Republican Party? Asha, can you hear me? Not hearing Asha on the line. There she is. There
muted.
She goes. Oh, classic Zoom mix-up.
I know. I've been doing this for 3 years, and I still mute myself.
I still do as well. No problem. Go ahead.
I don't have an answer for that question. I really think that's for the political analysts to answer. I mean, obviously, there's some tie that they feel that they need to, go down on the ship with him. I don't have an answer for you from a legal perspective.
Maya, can you maybe help me out with this?
Well, I mean, it's. I want to make sure that I understand exactly what we're asking here.
Just the kind of grip, and I don't know if you can get this when you get a sense of when you're talking to voters. Just the kind of grip that Donald Trump still seems to have over the Republican Party.
Well, I think we can say, 1/3 of the Republican primary electorate is solidly in former President Trump's camp. And that is the most vocal and the most active and the most, I think that we can say, powerful wing of the Republican primary electorate. These are the people who, when Trump endorsed his candidates across the country, extremely flawed candidates who ended up losing a lot of general elections, I mean, these were the folks who still supported those candidates and got them to the general. And these are the people who are hoping to get former President Trump out of a Republican presidential primary into a general election. And now, according to polling and conversations with strategists and others, I mean, the indictment has expanded that number of people, at least by anywhere from 5 to 10%. So I think you can say that the hold that former President Trump has on the Republican Party is still very, very strong and very solid. And I think that's also why you have a lot of jockeying in the 2024 primary among his competitors or would-be competitors. Folks aren't, rushing to come out and criticize him yet because they know that they also would like to cut into some of the support that he has from the base. And this is something that has alarmed a lot of Republicans who might want to see somebody different in the general election.
Thank you so much, Maya. A big thank you to Maya and our powerhouse trio. We had Asha, Maya, and Liz for breaking down this legal and political impacts of Trump's indictment. Thank you so much for joining us on The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Today's show, produced by Meg Dalton, our technical producer, Kat Pastor. And thank you so much to Katie Pellico for helping us out with phone calls today. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for listening.